Hey, how's it going everyone? Today I bring you guys a fight that I'm sure you weren't expecting. The Doctor of Delight, Bugs Bunny, versus the future King of the Pirate, Monkey D. Luffy. It's April 1st, and what better fight to talk about on this gloriously foolish day than the greatest Toon in history versus the greatest Toon of today. This was originally going to be an entire joke where I used a single SBS answer from Oda to scale Luffy above Bugs Bunny, but when I started looking at Bugs' feats, I quickly came to the conclusion that it was going to be a lot closer than I originally thought without the SBS. I should make it very clear that I'm only going to use feats from the Looney Tunes Golden Collection. I only had so much time to watch Looney Tunes episodes before I had to start the editing process, so if you're wondering why I don't use specific feats from other series like Tiny Toons, The Looney Tunes Show, Space Jam, or any other Looney Tunes related spin-offs, well, there's your answer. I'm sure if I used a composite Bugs Bunny with all of the feats and nonsense that he's performed over the last 80 or so years, then he would absolutely curb stomp most of fiction, but I'm not really a fan of composite characters, and I'm actually not really sure as to what counts as canon Looney Tunes lore. There are comics, series, and movies that make callbacks to the original Merry Melodies cartoons, but there's no direct canon that I could find, so yeah, we'll just stick to the Golden Collection. Now before we begin, I want to be as transparent as possible. I'm aware that most people, whether or not they power scale, would automatically assume that Bugs Bunny or any other cartoon character should win almost every single matchup simply because they have Toon Force. I really don't like this term. Toon Force is a colloquial term coined by the internet at some point in the last 20 or so years. It's not technically a real thing, and it doesn't necessarily have a singular agreed upon definition. This is important to talk about because different people have different definitions for the term. Some people think there are levels of Toon Force, others think it's innate reality warping for the sake of a gag, and some simply believe that Toon Force is just the character following early Western toon logic and design. Whatever definition I go by, someone will say I'm using the wrong one, so for the sake of the video, I will develop my own definition of Toon Force and I'll break it down in more detail later. For now, all you need to know is that Toon Force is simply the ability to defy the laws of physics or logic in order to perform a gag. Simple, effective, and it should essentially encompass most characters with Toon Force. If you enjoy my content and want to support the channel, I would really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. We're getting close to 10k subs, and if we reach this goal, then I will make Naruto vs Luffy happen. I also have a Discord server which you can gain access to by joining my Ko-Fi or by becoming a YouTube member. The community is slowly growing, and you can talk about all of your favorite series and scaling without ever having to worry about it getting toxic. We like to promote healthy power scaling. So with all that out of the way, let's begin. I'm just going to rip off the band-aid with this one and be honest. If we're going by just raw stats alone, Luffy is curb stomping the loony out of Bugs' tunes. I know it sounds insane, but when it comes down to the Golden Collection, Bugs, while he does have very impressive feats, is not as impressive as Luffy. When it comes to scaling, context and narrative are extremely important. Something that many of you may not know is that the Looney Tunes are actually all working within the Warner Brothers studios. Every single cartoon they make always follows some sort of formula. I can't tell you how many times I've had to hear Elmer Fudd say, "Be very, very quiet, I'm hunting rabbits." While there are differences here and there, and the characters do sometimes go off script, it becomes very obvious very quickly that the characters are just playing a part in a role. It's also consistently shown that Bugs is a star, and fellow characters like Porky Pig and Elmer Fudd do show their contracts with Mr. Warner. That's not to say that Bugs is weak by any means, since a lot of his feats can still be used, but it does bring up to question two specific feats, which I will be talking about later. In reality, Bugs is an absolute menace to society in every sense of the word. Quick side tangent. Power scaling is all about interpretation. How you reach a conclusion may greatly differ from the conclusion somebody else drew while watching the same piece of media. Scaling the Looney Tunes isn't exactly easy because you have to make a ton of assumptions. For example, one of his best feats is running from Wyoming to New York in under 4 minutes and 26 seconds. This is the amount of real time that he took from the moment he said go to the moment he reached the finish line. In reality, the entire episode was essentially a bunch of cutaways where both he and Cecil Turtle went to Chicago and then got to New York in a few transitions. The amount of time is unquantifiable unless you say they started and finished the race in the same day or you go by real time. If you go by real time, then Bugs traveled at a speed of about 25,958 miles per hour. That would technically put him on the mid-end of high hypersonic. I'm going to do my best to rationalize some of the scaling for Bugs because it is entirely dependent on how you interpret the transitions and consistency of the feats, and there are technically a lot of inconsistencies. With that being said, Bugs tanked the moon exploding. In this episode, he meets Marvin Martian, who is going to blow up the Earth using the uranium Pu-36 explosive space modulator. I'm sure some would argue that Bugs should have planetary durability since it was stated by Marvin himself. However, one thing I believe should be kept in mind is that Marvin was attempting to connect it to this rocket in order to blow up the Earth. When triggered on its own, it only blew up a large portion of the moon. This would mean that either the explosive space modulator was only going to blow up a portion of the Earth, which would still fall under the definition of destroying it, or it can completely destroy the Earth if fired from the rocket. Since he tanked it without taking any damage, one could argue that he likely has at least moon to planetary durability depending on how you see this feat. Regardless, this is an extremely impressive feat from Bugs since he was relatively close to Marvin when he set it off. One possibility I would also like to add is that Bugs could have potentially dodged the explosion instead of tanking it. Neither he nor Marvin or his dog show any signs of damage. It's honestly up to you whether or not Bugs tanked or dodged the explosion. However, he never really does anything even remotely as impressive as this feat again, at least when it comes to his durability. Whenever Bugs gets hit within any of the cartoons he stars in, he doesn't seem to ever show any prolonged signs of damage. He was grabbed by a gorilla and got body slammed and stumped on by it. Bugs didn't fight back, he didn't do anything witty, he simply tanked all of his attacks until he tired himself out. There's also an example where he does get punched in the head and is seemingly put down until the next scene when he fought the bull in Spain. I want to make it clear that I don't think the bull has planetary attack potency. The episodes are essentially self-contained, and I don't think one could argue that the animators and director of the episode intended for the bull to hit with planetary AP. This is what I mean when I said scaling the Looney Tunes isn't exactly easy. A lot of the feats are going to be either consistent with one another to a relative degree, or they are going to be one-time gags. Anyway, the most amount of damage I've seen Bugs take usually comes in when he's on the butt end of a joke or when he's completely off guard, like when he gets head lumps from an anvil he hit while doing a circus performance with Bruno the Bear, or when he gets shot in the head by Baby Finster and then Finster beats him with a bat multiple times, leaving him a black eye while seeing stars. He does actually get hit with a few shotgun blasts every now and then, but they never really deal any damage. When he gets hit with a steel girder, he also seems to be stunned for an extended period of time, until he gets some water splashed on him. His durability seems to be as high as moon to planetary while on guard, and it's low enough to be hurt by props and bats while off guard. Moving back to speed, it's extremely difficult to truly pinpoint how fast he is. Although he's usually portrayed to be faster than the Hunter, and no, I don't mean Elmer. Whenever Bugs is chased by anyone, in this case we'll call them hunters, he's usually capable of outrunning them and their shenanigans. Granted, he also deals with some massive ignoramuses that make Luffy look like a damn genius by comparison. Going back to the feat I brought up earlier where he ran from Wyoming to New York, if you at least try to quantify it by applying real time, then he would end up around the mid-end of high hypersonic, but there's also another feat where he's chased by Yosemite Sam from Alaska to Fort Knox in about 11 seconds real time, which would make it a high-end, massively hypersonic feat. As many of you may know, I don't like using real-world calcs to quantify a character's abilities because there's a lot of factors that one might have to ignore. In this case, I have to ignore the fact that he performed this feat through a scene transition and a montage. In the very same race episode where we can technically get him to mid-end high hypersonic, he also says that he was doing 100 easily, and when we see the cops, it says the speed limit is 30. This is obviously an anti-feat, and to add on, he was also exhausted after running at 100 miles an hour for a few seconds. One more thing I'd like to add is that Bugs did build an entire city in the back of a town in a couple of seconds. I can't actually tell you how fast it was, only because we never got a full scope of the city, and obviously he did it all off screen. It's still pretty funny to think about though. So his speed is at its best inconsistent, but still slower than Luffy, and his durability is reliant on how on guard he is. Bugs Bunny's AP is all over the place. In terms of raw brute force, Bugs literally displays some of the most inconsistent and funniest feats I have ever seen. He can lift 500 and 950 pound weights, but he couldn't lift a steel sword. He could punch away the dirty fighter Crusher, but in most instances where he needs raw strength, Bugs can't budge the guy, and his own punches never seem to do any real damage. His strength definitely seems to be more effective against other Toons of his size, but when he's really pushed to his peak, Bugs is a monster. He tied up all of the railroads in the US, and he sawed off Florida straight through and then kicked it away with his foot to South America. That's pretty much the best Bugs has to offer in terms of feats when it comes to the Golden Collection, and if you want my honest opinion, it isn't enough. Bugs can't hurt Luffy under any circumstance I can think of. I kept a list of the objects that he spawned or used during his escapades, and most of them are ineffective because Luffy has either tanked larger explosions or his rubber body makes blunt force trauma essentially ineffective. I know, the One Piece power scaler is downplaying Bugs Bunny so that Luffy can win. I know it sounds completely insane to many of you that Bugs can't hurt Luffy, but this is a genuine conclusion I came down to. When considering a versus battle, one needs to look at both characters and not just the one they want to win. In order to be fair, one should ask themselves how would the other character deal with these feats or abilities. Some of Bugs' most common items in any encounter are explosives, usually in the form of dynamite, and heavy anvils or brick walls. These are things that Luffy has either dealt with or is entirely immune to. You can't just ignore the fact that Luffy has tanked massive explosions or taken extremely powerful blows from opponents who can bypass his rubber body just because you had the preconceived notion that Bugs wins. But it's not enough to just say that Luffy is too tough, let's prove it. I can't believe it's taking me this long to make a versus battle involving Luffy. I've talked about this character enough in many of my other videos since I use him as a bridge in order to scale characters within the world of One Piece. This video won't have the most in-depth analysis for Luffy, but I will provide a small series of comprehensive arguments in order to show how powerful he is and why Bugs shouldn't really be capable of doing anything to him, at least as far as causing damage. Luffy is way faster than light. Even on a massive low ball, he should be at a bare minimum 10 times faster than light by the start of the post time skip. He already performed light speed feats in base form during the latter half of the pre-time skip era, and the reason why we're getting him to a 10 times bare minimum for his post-time skip self is because he should be, at the very least, as strong as his second gear self from pre-time skip. Second gear is a 10 times amp as stated in the One Piece Yellow Databook. If you're doubtful about Luffy's speed or the One Piece light speed meta, I have an entire video where I go over it. I don't really need to quantify Luffy's speed to be any greater than this, because in all honesty, whatever extent of FTL I can get Luffy to in the later arcs is essentially pointless. He is way faster than Bugs in base form alone. As for attack potency, in Dressrosa, we're introduced to two characters named Don Chinjao and Sai. Don Chinjao is stated verbatim to have the capacity to split a continent of ice and literally performs a feat where he splits it. This ice is so tough that metal pickaxes and fire cannot scratch it, so it's tougher than the very ground we step on. Even the Japanese translation uses the kanji for continent. Chinjao himself stated that his grandson should now be capable of also splitting the ice continent, which means he is also continental. Both of these characters are weaker than Doflamingo and Luffy. A quick comparison I want to bring up here is that Luffy was capable of fixing the damage his grandfather had caused to Chinjao's head when he hit him with his elephant gun, and Dansai was capable of breaking his grandfather's head when he hit him with his drilled dragon nail after Luffy fixed it. This at least implies that Luffy's AP should be within the continental ranges by this point in the story while using his elephant gun. Doffy could stop elephant gun with a single spider web, but when Luffy used Gear 4, he shattered Doffy's spiderweb with a single hand, which means Luffy, while using Gear 4, should have beyond continental AP. By the time of the rooftop fight against Kaido and Big Mom, 2.5 arcs later, Luffy should have surpassed his Gear 4 self from Dressrosa in his base. Kaido previously blitzed and one-shot a stronger version of Gear 4 Luffy coming right out of Whole Cake Island, which means Luffy's base should be on a massive low ball several times beyond continental. So how do we get him to moon or planetary levels? Gear 4 is a transformation that can have a quantifiable amp depending on how you choose to interpret its connection to second and third gear. I'm going to use the lowest possible amp for Gear 4, which is 30 times. The word several can be interpreted as a bare minimum of at least 3. When Luffy uses Advanced Conqueror's Haki, he performs better against Kaido than he previously did with Gear 4, but we will lowball it so that they're equal amps. He can stack Gear 4 and Advanced Conqueror's Haki in order to give himself a 900 times amp beyond his continental base. Now, I'm not sure what some of you would call planetary, but if you ask me, someone who is 900 times continental should be planetary. Which means Luffy should have the attack potency on a massive low ball to hurt Bugs Bunny. As for durability, he tanked multiple hits from Kaido and his stronger forms that could previously one-shot his Continental Gear 4 self. Since Kaido is relative to Gear 5 Luffy, who should be above planetary in terms of attack potency, that means Luffy should have planetary levels of durability as well. I know some of you are probably raising an eyebrow at the scaling for Luffy, but like I've said, I've already spoken about him in great detail throughout many of my videos. I really only need to scale him to the point he can overpower Bugs, and even on a low ball, it's relatively easy. We could talk about the Uranium Pu-36 explosive space modulator, but that isn't a part of Bugs' toolkit. Out of all of the things Bugs Bunny has used for his gags throughout the Golden Collection, the explosive space modulator is something that specifically belongs to Marvin Martian. The only reason Bugs even had it in the first place was because he took it from Marvin and then triggered it afterwards, so even if I were to give him the explosive space modulator, he would only have one copy of it, and it wouldn't be enough to put Luffy down in a single hit. Between the massive inconsistency of Bugs Bunny's physical capabilities, and even with the highest interpretations I can give him, he shouldn't stand a chance against Luffy in a normal fight. But that's the thing, this isn't gonna be a normal fight. This is a fight involving Bugs Bunny, and luckily for him, he's already got experience in fighting opponents that physically outmatch him. As a matter of fact, Luffy is the perfect opponent for Bugs to employ what he likes to call strategies. You see, Bugs is unironically the worst matchup possible for Monkey D. Luffy. He is a trickster god who does not play fair. As a matter of fact, he's the exact opposite of Luffy, who only chooses to fight fair. Even to the point where Oda himself stated in an SBS he wouldn't use Future Sight to win at rock, paper, scissors. Bugs, on the other hand, will cheat in almost any game or fight he partakes in, whether it's giving himself a head start in a race, miscounting the number of strokes he performed while playing golf, or looking at his opponent's hand while playing cards. Bugs will use whatever advantage he can get, and unfortunately for our dear rubber boy, this is exactly what is going to get him a win. If Bugs ever turns this fight into a game, then Luffy will likely not cheat regardless of the circumstances. As long as he performs most of his gags within the context of a game or competition, he will always have an advantage over Luffy. Zoro stated himself back in Thriller Bark that Luffy does have weaknesses. Characters that use trickery and deceit in order to fight are especially troublesome. While Luffy might outstat Bugs Bunny, considering that Bugs can usually manipulate the tempo of a fight by using his opponent's strengths against them or by outwitting them, would mean that Luffy is going to have a very tough time trying to land a hit. I think it's about time we talk about Toon Force. The major consensus I usually see when anyone talks about this ability is that characters who have it should always win against characters who don't, and when talking about characters who both have Toon Force, the one with better control or a quote-unquote higher level should always win. I obviously disagree with both of these notions. If you ask me, Toon Force is something that is entirely unquantifiable, and it's really just a plot device for the characters to do whatever the writer wants them to do with a side of humor. There is no way to define what a level of Toon Force is or how one character can have better control over another. Let's go back to my definition of Toon Force. One of the things I neglected to add was the following. Each iteration of Toon Force is differentiated within the context of its franchise and may follow a different set of rules. This is just a fancy way to say that every single version of Toon Force is specific to each story. Though there may be some similarities between different series like Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, or Popeyes the Sailor Man, the way they may apply their Toon Force may differ. For example, Popeyes literally punched his own creator at one point. To further push this idea, some people have said that Luffy has Toon Force, and because of that, he's now one of the most powerful anime characters ever because his powers are all about imagination and he can just imagine himself winning. I don't agree with this because it ignores the context of what Luffy can actually do given his own version of Toon Force. Spoiler alert, if you don't want to see any manga panels for the upcoming second half of the Egghead arc, skip to this timestamp. We good? Okay. Many people have gone out of their way to say that Luffy now has Toon Force and is essentially a god of creation because he was able to turn his hair into a pair of goggles, grabbed a paint bucket and a baseball helmet out of seemingly nowhere, and lost all of the features in his body, including his scars, which he later pasted back on. I've talked about this before in my What It Means to Fight Monkey D. Luffy video, but Luffy's Toon Force is entirely limited within the context of his abilities. It is all just a byproduct of his Devil Fruit awakening. The things he seemingly spawns out of nowhere are all just there for the sake of a gag. The paint bucket, helmet, and goggles, for example, add nothing to the fight whatsoever besides being one-time jokes. It's not that Luffy has a lower level of Toon Force or less control, more so his Toon Force, like any other version of the ability, is working within the rules of its narrative. And like Luffy, Bugs' Toon Force also has to follow a set of rules. To further expand my idea of the hunter that I brought up before, you can break down most Looney Tunes cartoons to the following set of rules: the hunter and the wabbit, or cat and mouse for my Tom and Jerry enjoyers. The hunters are usually the aggressors in every one of these cartoons, constantly chasing the wabbits. It's the relationship between these roles that constantly allows Bugs to get one up on all of his adversaries, even those who physically outmatch him. However, Bugs isn't always the wabbit. There are a few examples where Bugs is usually put in the position of the hunter, one of which happened when he was dealing with Elmer Fudd, who had recently learned hypnotism, and Bugs hypnotized Elmer into thinking that he was a rabbit. Doing so swapped their roles, and now Bugs was chasing Elmer, and he ended up being the butt end of the joke. Though it's not very common, there are episodes where Bugs ends up playing the role of the hunter. Even simply annoying him to the point he wants to hurt you is enough to switch the roles. I'm sure many of you watching this weren't expecting a breakdown of this fight to be so in-depth, especially since we're talking about two of the goofiest characters in fiction, but this ended up being a lot more meta than I originally thought. For example, one of Bugs' most common gags is wearing an outfit to confuse or misdirect his opponent. He typically dresses as a woman to seduce his opponents, but against Luffy it'll be ineffective since he's never shown any attraction towards women, including the world's most beautiful woman, Boa Hancock. However, this doesn't mean this gag is entirely ineffective. Even a simple beard or a mask should be enough to catch his gullible ass on the wrong end of a dynamite stick. One thing I would like to add is that while Luffy may be gullible and he would certainly fall for many of Bugs' tricks, he's not that stupid. Luffy is one of the most adaptive fighters in shonen. He has consistently shown time and time again that he can employ new tactics or adjustments to his combat style in order to defeat his opponents. He did it with Crocodile, CP9, Katakuri, and most importantly, Kaido. Eventually, he's going to catch on to Bugs' antics, and he'll likely deal with them easily enough since he can literally see into the future. This is why Bugs would likely have to turn this fight into a competition. That way he can ensure that Luffy doesn't use Future Sight, but that would mean we're giving Bugs intel. As for regular observation haki, while Luffy can sense the emotions and intent of those around him, I don't think he'll ever really sense any malice from Bugs, more so mischief. I could also talk about Super Rabbit, but he doesn't really do anything that's more impressive than any of the things I've previously mentioned besides the fact that he can fly. There is an episode where he does invade Elmer's dream using sleeping pills and paints the entire night sky with nightmare paint only to then multiply himself by billions and twillions, as Elmer put it, but all of that happened while inside the dream. There's nothing else I feel like I need to talk about besides the verdict. While I did say that Bugs can't hurt Luffy, that doesn't mean he can't outlast him. The only times Bugs ever seems to show any fatigue are when he's performing constant physical feats like running at top speed for extended periods of time. Even then, he seems to recuperate relatively quickly after catching his breath. I honestly think that Bugs' best win con in regards to this fight is to mess with Luffy until he can't move anymore. I would say that's easier said than done, but there really isn't much that Luffy can technically do. He would have to either annoy Bugs enough that he's now considered the Wabbit, or he would have to catch Bugs off guard with Gear 5. Luckily, he is a lot more playful while using Gear 5, so this could be a possibility. After all, Bugs still has to play by the rules of his own Toon Force. If he can annoy Bugs enough that he'll be the Wabbit and Bugs will be the Hunter, he can have complete control of the fight for as long as the roles are reversed. Although, if he doesn't beat Bugs before he tires out, and this can easily happen if he's using Gear 5th, he's definitely losing, and I honestly can't tell you how many punches it would take to put down that despicable wascally Wabbit, so it's definitely an uphill battle. Unless you think Luffy has more firepower than the entire 1940s US military. You see, during the episode where Bugs cut off Florida, he ended up getting a bounty of $1 million and subsequently had the entire force of the US military called upon him. Now, they didn't drop a nuke on him, but they caught him at the end of the episode and put him in jail, which means that with enough violence, Bugs can be caught. Becoming an Emperor of the Sea meant that Luffy should now have equal firepower to the Marines, which would include its 3 admirals. I don't know about you guys, but I think that the One Piece Marines are a more powerful organization than the 1940s US Army. So by this metric, you can definitely make an argument that Luffy can beat Bugs Bunny, or at least capture him. I think either outcome of the fight will be entertaining enough, but in reality, if I had to give you an answer, I'd probably give it to Bugs. There are 2 specific feats that he performs at the end of their respective episodes, which I've neglected to talk about up until now. The first one is probably the most famous one, which is the time Bugs Bunny was an animator for an episode and messed with Daffy Duck the entire time. I'm probably the first person to say this, but I don't think Bugs Bunny has reality warping abilities, at least to the extent that you would assume from watching this clip. Remember what I said about these characters being actors? Well, there are episodes where Daffy Duck is shrunken down. The average interpretation of this episode is that Bugs has reality manipulation powers since he can essentially manipulate the canvas of Daffy's story. I, however, don't look at it that way, especially after watching multiple seasons worth of the show. Daffy can shrink, it's pretty consistent, or at least I've seen it more times than I've seen Bugs do this. If I had to be honest, he simply shrunk himself down and just played a bit the entire time. After all, Daffy Duck is commonly one of the biggest punching bags in the franchise. I don't think Bugs Bunny is a higher tier dimensional being than Daffy Duck. If anything, this is a pretty common gag in the series where Bugs gets top billing and Daffy gets screwed. If I had to be honest, regardless of how you look at it, he wouldn't perform this feat in this fight specifically because he would have to be off screen anyway in order to mess with Luffy to this extent. He can't perform this feat and also be in the fight at the same time. The second feat we need to talk about, I do think pertains more to this battle, because in an episode where Bugs was fighting Crusher, the end of the episode resulted in Bugs being tied up and about to get run over by a train. He ended up severing the film of the cartoon in order to save himself. As a reminder, these are filmed cartoons. Bugs could have simply gotten the actual film as it was playing and just cut it up because he probably didn't like the end of the episode and didn't want anyone to see it. I don't know, it was left pretty open-ended. I do think because of the context of these characters being actors and a lot of this just being skits for them, a lot of the feats that people use for these characters are blown out of proportion. However, if you were going to go with the high-end interpretations of these feats, that's fine by me. It just means Luffy then has basically no chance, since Bugs can always just snip away the end of the fight, so we don't see a winner. But if that's the case, then that would mean Luffy would have technically have won. But that's all, folks. If you enjoyed the video, maybe consider liking and subscribing. Maybe. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I will catch you all in the next one. Peace out.